300 years may seem like a long time, but echoes from the past never truly disappear. Imagine a dynasty whose name once carried the weight of kingdoms, whose crowns glittered over Scotland, England, and Ireland, and whose ambitions reached far beyond the shores of Britain. When we hear the name Stuart, we often think of Mary Queen of Scots, the tragic figure caught between politics and betrayal, or the glorious revolution that swept James II from power. Yet the Stuarts were far more than a few well-known names and dramatic moments. Their story is one of power and loss, faith and exile, survival and reinvention. It is also a story of shadows, of hidden branches on the family tree, of princes and princesses who lived in obscurity, but whose choices quietly shaped the world around them. What if the Stuarts were not only a dynasty of thrones and rebellions, but also a family whose influence stretched across Europe through marriages, alliances, and ideas? What if the ones history forgets were the ones who left the most lasting marks? Behind the celebrated monarchs are others whose names have faded, yet their actions sent ripples through culture, politics, and even the economic foundations of modern Europe. Their legacies remain, waiting to be uncovered and understood. Today, we step into those forgotten corridors of time to rediscover the unseen Stuarts, the overlooked heirs, and the exiles who helped shape the destiny of nations in ways often invisible but never insignificant. Their tale is not just about the past. It is about how history itself is written, remembered, and sometimes deliberately forgotten. Welcome to our channel Words of Time. In this video, we begin our journey into the fading echoes of Stuart power, exploring how a dynasty remembered for crowns and rebellions also left behind hidden legacies that still matter today. The Stuart dynasty occupies a complicated and often misunderstood place in British and European history. When most people think of the Stuarts, a few striking images come to mind. There is Mary, Queen of Scots, remembered for her tragic downfall and execution, and there is the Glorious Revolution, which ended with the deposition of James II and the ascension of William and Mary. These 2 points in time seem to frame how the dynasty is popularly remembered, as if their long story can be summed up only by tragedy at the start and displacement at the end. Yet the Stuarts were far more than a pair of dramatic moments. They were a family with many branches, connections, and influences that reached across Britain and into Europe. To reduce them to a few figures is to miss the echoes of a dynasty that shaped kingdoms and cultures, but whose legacy now often feels faint. To understand why this fading occurred, one must consider how history is written and remembered. Historians, chroniclers, and storytellers tend to focus on the events that carry the most drama or that fit into a clear political or moral narrative. Mary, Queen of Scots, fits that mold perfectly. She was a queen whose life had all the elements of a legend: beauty, danger, romance, betrayal, and death. Likewise, the Glorious Revolution is remembered because it marked a turning point in constitutional history, the beginning of a settlement that would shape the balance of monarchy and parliament in England. These are convenient bookends for the story of the Stuarts, but they obscure everything that lies between and beyond. The Stuarts were not just a dynasty of England or Scotland. They were, in fact, a Scottish royal family who rose to rule over multiple kingdoms through circumstance and inheritance. Their story stretches back into the Middle Ages, when the family first began to rise in prominence as hereditary stewards of the Scottish crown. It was from this position of service that they gained their name, Stuart, which later took on the French spelling Stuart when Mary, Queen of Scots, was raised in France. From these roots, the family grew in power until it was poised to take the Scottish throne outright. The rise was not sudden, but by the time of Robert II, the Stuarts had transformed themselves from servants of the crown into kings in their own right. What often goes overlooked is the continuity and stability they provided in Scotland for centuries. Before the union of the crowns, they had already been ruling Scotland for several generations. Their reign saw conflicts, both internal and external, but it also provided a thread of dynastic stability that was not always present in other kingdoms of Europe during the same period. Scotland had endured times of dynastic uncertainty before, yet with the Stuarts the kingdom gained a line that would last for generations. Still, these earlier Stuart kings, from Robert II through James V, are seldom remembered today outside specialist circles. Their reigns are overshadowed because they lack the theatrical tragedy of Mary or the constitutional upheaval of the later English period. Yet without them, the more famous chapters would never have been possible. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England in the early 17th century, the Stuarts reached a new height of power. This union of the crowns in 1603 brought together two kingdoms under a single monarch. For James, this was the realization of his dream of a unified Britain. For the dynasty, it was the beginning of a more complex and often troubled legacy. James was a learned man, often mocked in his lifetime for his peculiar manner, but respected for his scholarship. He oversaw the commissioning of the King James Bible, one of the most influential translations of the scripture in the English language. Yet his reign was also marked by tensions with Parliament and struggles over religious settlement. His rule set the stage for the conflicts his son, Charles I, would inherit and eventually lose. Charles I's downfall and execution in 1649 remain among the most shocking moments in British history. A king tried and executed by his own subjects shattered the idea of divine right monarchy in England. For the Stuarts, it was a wound from which their reputation never fully recovered. The interregnum under Oliver Cromwell was short in years but long in its shadow, for it revealed that monarchy was not an untouchable institution. When Charles II was restored in 1660, he attempted to balance the dignity of the crown with the reality of parliamentary power. His reign was remembered for its cultural vibrancy and for the image of the merry monarch. But beneath the surface it was filled with suspicion, plots, and religion. The final Stuart kingship under James II proved short and disastrous. His open Catholicism and attempts to restore toleration for his co-religionists led to widespread fears of a return to absolutism and papal influence. When William of Orange and his wife Mary, James's own daughter, were invited to take the throne in 1688, James fled. The so-called Glorious Revolution is celebrated as a bloodless transfer of power, though it was not bloodless in Ireland or Scotland, where wars erupted in defense of the deposed king. For the Stuart dynasty, this was the end of their rule in Britain, though not the end of their story. The exiled Stuarts, known as the Jacobites, continued to claim their rights to the throne for generations. James II's son, James Francis Edward, called the Old Pretender, maintained his claim from abroad, and his son, Charles Edward Stuart, known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, became the romantic figurehead of the Jacobite cause. The failed rising of 1745 ended with the defeat at Culloden and the effective end of serious Stuart hopes for restoration. Yet even here, the popular memory focuses on the romance of Bonnie Prince Charlie, his flight, and the songs that celebrated his cause, rather than the broader reality of a dynasty in exile. The Stuarts were more than failed pretenders. They were part of the fabric of European politics, intermarried with other royal houses, and involved in continental struggles. This brings us to one of the most striking aspects of the dynasty's fading echoes, the forgotten branches. History has a way of simplifying dynasties to their most dramatic or successful members. In the case of the Stuarts, those who remained in exile, married into continental nobility, or lived lives outside the limelight of the British throne are often ignored. The family did not simply vanish in 1746. Their bloodlines continued, their descendants lived in various European courts, and their names still carried weight long after their thrones were lost. Yet because they did not sit on the throne of Britain, they slipped from the popular story. This tendency is not unique to the Stuarts. Royal families often had numerous branches, some of which fell into obscurity even while others rose to prominence. The Tudors, by comparison, are remembered in almost singular focus, because their line was short and ended without heirs beyond Elizabeth I. The Stuarts, however, spread across multiple kingdoms and generations. Some lived in the shadow of greater figures, and some took part in intrigues that history forgot. By overlooking these branches, we also overlook the way in which dynastic politics truly functioned, as a web of connections rather than a straight line of kings and queens. The reasons for this forgetting are many. Political convenience played a role. After the Glorious Revolution and the eventual Hanoverian succession, it was not in the interest of British historians or politicians to keep alive the memory of alternative claimants. The official narrative celebrated the stability and Protestant legitimacy of the Hanoverians, which meant minimizing the legitimacy of the exiled Stuarts. Over time, this official forgetting became cultural forgetting. The Stuart story was compressed into a tale of tragedy, rebellion, and romance, but the broader family history faded away. And yet, if we listen carefully, the echoes of their legacy remain. They can be found in the cultural and religious conflicts of Britain, in the architecture and literature of the Stuart age, and in the genealogies of European nobility. They can also be heard in the songs and legends of the Jacobite cause, which turned failure into romance. Even in their fading, the Stuarts managed to inspire myth. Perhaps that is their truest legacy, not the solid foundation of power, but the lingering shadow of memory, half forgotten but never fully gone. As we step into the shadows of this lesser-known legacy, we see a dynasty that was more than just Mary, Queen of Scots, and the Glorious Revolution. We see a family that rose from service to sovereignty, that ruled across kingdoms, that endured triumph and loss, and that spread across Europe in ways that outlasted their crowns. We see branches of a royal tree cut short in some places and flourishing quietly in others. The story of the Stuarts is not one of simple rise and fall, but of persistence and fading, of power grasped and power lost, and of echoes that continue to sound long after the dynasty itself ceased to reign. When we move further into the story of the Stuarts, away from the better-known monarchs and great moments of revolution or downfall, we begin to uncover figures who lived in the shadows of the main narrative. These were the so-called hidden Stuarts, individuals whose lives and ambitions were tied to the great family tree, but who did not occupy the throne or command armies in their own name. Their presence reminds us that dynasties are never a single line of kings and queens. They are instead large, branching networks of people, each carrying some part of the family identity, and each shaped by the weight of expectations and the accidents of history. To understand them is to understand how a royal family functions not only at its center, but also along its edges. The first point of connection is always lineage. These peripheral Stuarts were never distant pretenders with no blood tie to the main line. They were brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles, and children of those who ruled. Some were placed in positions of power to support the monarch. Some were married off to forge alliances, and others found themselves excluded from succession but still burdened with the Stuart name. In many cases, their lives were defined by proximity to the throne rather than direct rule. It is this closeness without possession that makes their stories both fascinating and tragic. To begin with, the Scottish Stuarts before the union of the crowns already produced multiple branches. Robert II, the first Stuart King of Scotland, had a large number of children. His descendants filled many noble houses in Scotland, creating cadet branches that played significant roles in the politics of the kingdom. These included the Stuarts of Albany and the Stuarts of Lennox. The Albany line in particular came close to ruling Scotland in its own right. Robert Stuart, Duke of Albany, was regent for much of the early 15th century, effectively running the kingdom during the captivity of James I in England. Though he never claimed the crown, his power was so extensive that he could be considered a king in all but name. His descendants continued to wield influence, and the rivalry between Albany and the main royal line shaped Scottish politics for decades. Yet today the Albany Stuarts are little remembered, overshadowed by the later English drama. The Lennox branch of the family would, in time, prove more directly important to the main story. From them came Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, who married Mary, Queen of Scots, and fathered James VI of Scotland and I of England. Darnley himself was not merely a consort. He carried a Stuart claim in his own right, being descended from the Lennox line. His marriage to Mary was thus not only a union of persons, but a strengthening of dynastic legitimacy. Yet Darnley's life ended in violence, with his murder remaining one of the great unsolved mysteries of Scottish history. His death illustrates how dangerous it was to be close to power, but not securely in command of it. As we move forward to the period after the union of the crowns, the hidden Stuarts take on new forms. The children and siblings of monarchs who did not inherit the throne still bore the weight of dynastic expectation. For example, Charles I's children included not only Charles II and James II, who would rule, but also daughters like Mary, who became Princess of Orange, and Henrietta Anne, who married into the French royal family. These women played roles in European politics, often acting as intermediaries between their natal and marital families. Yet because they did not reign in Britain, their stories are often neglected in the broader narrative of Stuart history. Henrietta Anne, for instance, lived a brief but influential life at the French court. Married to Philippe, Duke of Orleans, the brother of Louis XIV, she was placed at the center of French politics. She was admired for her charm and wit, and she acted as a diplomatic go-between in the negotiations that led to the Treaty of Dover between Charles II and Louis XIV. Her early death at the age of 26 was a blow to both courts. Though she never reigned, her life demonstrates how the Stuart legacy extended far beyond Britain into continental affairs. Another hidden figure is James, Duke of York, who would later become James II. Before his accession, his role as a younger son carried expectations without guarantees. His early naval career helped shape the English Navy, and his conversion to Catholicism in a Protestant country foreshadowed the crisis that would end his reign. In this way, even those Stuarts who eventually became kings experienced periods of marginalization, living in the shadow of elder siblings and uncertain inheritance. The exiled Stuarts after the Glorious Revolution also created peripheral lines. James II fled to France, taking with him his son, James Francis Edward Stuart. Known as the Old Pretender, he claimed the throne but lived his life largely in exile, dependent on the support of European courts. His children, particularly Charles Edward Stuart and Henry Benedict Stuart, continued the family line in exile. Charles, the young pretender, is remembered for his dramatic attempt to reclaim the throne in 1745, but his brother Henry chose a different path, becoming a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church. Henry's life shows how some Stuarts, stripped of worldly power, turned to spiritual authority. His existence as a prince cardinal is a reminder of the variety of ways royal identity could manifest when political avenues were closed. Beyond these central exiled figures, there were cousins and relatives scattered across Europe. Some married into lesser noble families, others into prominent continental dynasties. The blood of the Stuarts spread through the courts of France, Spain, and Italy. Over time, these branches blended into the wider European nobility, their direct connection to the British throne less important than the alliances they represented. These hidden Stuarts may have lost their crowns, but they continued to influence politics through kinship and marriage. Their ambitions varied depending on circumstance. For those close to the throne, the ambition was often simply survival and recognition. In a world where royal succession was uncertain and rival claims could be deadly, being a peripheral Stuart could mean living in constant danger. Ambition might be forced upon them, as in the case of Darnley, whose marriage to Mary, Queen of Scots, positioned him at the heart of dynastic struggle whether he wished it or not. For others, ambition took the form of serving as regents, diplomats, or churchmen, shaping policy indirectly. What unites these hidden Stuarts is the tension between their royal blood and their lack of secure power. They were never ordinary nobles, for their name carried the weight of kingship. But they were also never entirely free, for their actions were judged against the backdrop of dynastic expectation. Their lives were shaped by proximity, close enough to matter, but rarely central enough to define the dynasty's story. As we uncover their presence, the fading echoes of the Stuart dynasty grow clearer. The family was not only a tale of crowned monarchs and dramatic revolutions, but also of countless men and women whose stories remain on the margins. These hidden Stuarts remind us that history often simplifies too much, reducing a dynasty to a few figures. Yet the reality was far more complex, filled with lives that mattered, even if they are now forgotten. They were the quiet bearers of the Stuart name, the guardians of legitimacy in exile, the intermediaries between courts, and the unwilling participants in dynastic rivalries. To bring them back into the story is to restore depth to our understanding of the Stuarts, a family whose influence stretched across centuries and across Europe, even as their crowns slipped from their grasp. When we step beyond the borders of Britain and follow the Stuarts into Europe, the picture of the dynasty changes in important ways. Within Britain, their story is often told as a struggle between monarchy and parliament, or between Catholic and Protestant faiths, ending in failure and exile. But on the wider stage of Europe, the Stuarts were not simply a displaced dynasty. They were active participants in the intricate web of alliances, rivalries, and dynastic strategies that shaped the continent. To understand them only in a British frame is to miss their unexpected geopolitical threads that wove into the histories of France, Spain, Italy, and beyond. These connections, created through diplomacy, marriage, and ambition, demonstrate that even as the Stuarts faded from direct power in Britain, they remained significant actors in European politics. The Stuarts had been tied to continental affairs from the beginning of their rise. Mary, Queen of Scots, was raised in France and married the French Dauphin, becoming briefly Queen Consort of France. Her life illustrates how the family's fortunes were always tied to Europe. When she returned to Scotland as a widow, she brought with her not only French manners and culture, but also a direct reminder of how central continental alliances were to Stuart ambitions. The use of marriage to secure influence was a constant feature of the dynasty. Royal families of Europe did not marry simply for affection. They married to cement alliances, strengthen claims, and create networks of obligation. For the Stuarts, these marriages often meant placing themselves into the heart of European politics. James I of England and VI of Scotland pursued such strategies with vigor. He dreamed of creating peace in Europe through dynastic union and sought to marry his children into powerful continental families. His daughter Elizabeth married Frederick V, Elector Palatine of the Rhine, in what was at the time seen as a promising match that would strengthen Protestant alliances in the Holy Roman Empire. Yet this marriage pulled the Stuarts into the storm of the 30 Years' War. Frederick's brief reign as King of Bohemia, cut short in defeat, earned him the mocking title of the Winter King. Elizabeth became known as the Winter Queen, and their exile from Bohemia and the Palatinate began a long saga in which the Stuart family's fate was tied to continental conflict. Their children scattered across Europe, becoming part of a wide Stuart diaspora. Among them was Sophia of Hanover, whose eventual position as heir to the English throne under the Act of Settlement would change the course of British history. This link between the Stuarts and the Hanoverians shows how dynastic marriages could have consequences that were not felt for generations. Had Elizabeth and Frederick never married, the path that brought the Hanoverians to the British throne might never have opened. In this sense, the Stuarts, even in their apparent failures, were shaping the long-term structure of European dynastic succession. Charles I also pursued continental ties through marriage. His union with Henrietta Maria of France connected the English crown to the powerful Bourbon dynasty. Though controversial in Protestant England because Henrietta Maria was a Catholic, this marriage had significant diplomatic importance. It tied the Stuarts to France at a time when religious divisions threatened to destabilize Europe. Henrietta Maria herself became an important figure, both as queen consort and later in exile after the fall of Charles. She maintained networks in France and worked to support her children's claims, proving how marriage alliances were not just symbolic but active political tools. The children of Charles and Henrietta Maria extended these ties further. Their daughter Mary married William II of Orange, a union that bound the Stuarts to the Dutch House of Orange. This connection would eventually play a decisive role in the Glorious Revolution, when William III, the son of Mary and William, was invited to take the English throne alongside his wife Mary, daughter of James II. Thus, what began as a dynastic marriage for alliance purposes became the foundation for a major transfer of power. Here again, the Stuarts illustrate how marriages could shape international politics in ways that even the participants could not foresee. The exiled Stuarts after the Glorious Revolution continued to play roles in European courts. James II lived at Saint-Germain-en-Laye in France, supported by Louis XIV. His presence there was not only symbolic, but also a practical tool for French policy. Louis used the exiled Stuarts as a way to pressure England, holding the possibility of restoration as a bargaining chip in diplomacy. James's son, James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender, was likewise a figure of international significance. He was married to Maria Klementina Sobieska, granddaughter of the famous Polish King John III Sobieski. This marriage tied the Stuarts to one of the most celebrated royal families of Eastern Europe, and it brought them wealth and legitimacy. Their children, Charles Edward Stuart and Henry Benedict Stuart, carried this heritage with them, making the Stuart cause not only a British matter but a continental one. Charles Edward Stuart's attempt to reclaim the throne in 1745 was supported in part by French interests, showing how the Jacobite cause was always entangled with European rivalries. France, Spain, and other powers saw in the Stuarts an opportunity to destabilize Britain. The Jacobite risings were not merely domestic rebellions. They were episodes in a broader European contest. The defeat at Culloden ended serious hopes for restoration, but the fact that European courts continued to shelter and honor the Stuarts shows that their importance extended beyond British shores. Even Henry Benedict Stuart, who became a cardinal, carried geopolitical weight. As a senior member of the Catholic Church and a Stuart prince, he symbolized the blending of dynastic and spiritual authority. His very existence reminded Europe that the Stuart claim was not dead, and his presence in Rome gave the dynasty a place at the heart of Catholic politics. Looking at these international roles, it is clear that the Stuarts were never simply exiles fading into obscurity. They were active participants in the politics of Europe, used by greater powers when convenient, but also shaping outcomes through their marriages, claims, and ambitions. Their influence spread through bloodlines and alliances, creating webs of connection that outlasted their direct rule. This raises a series of what-ifs that historians often ponder. What if the Winter King and Queen had succeeded in Bohemia, creating a strong Protestant state in Central Europe tied to the Stuarts? The balance of the 30 Years' War could have been altered, with ripple effects across the continent. What if James II had managed to secure his throne, establishing a lasting Catholic dynasty in Britain? This could have tied England more firmly to Catholic Europe, changing the religious and political trajectory of the nation. What if Charles Edward Stuart had won at Culloden, restoring the Stuarts in the mid-18th century? The entire course of British imperial history, including its role in the American colonies, might have shifted. These possibilities remind us that history is not inevitable. The actions of individuals, even those who failed, had the potential to reshape the map of Europe. Another what if lies in the Hanoverian succession. The Act of Settlement of 1701 deliberately bypassed many Catholic heirs, including the direct Stuart line, in favor of the Protestant Sophia of Hanover, granddaughter of James I through Elizabeth. This decision created a Protestant succession that brought the Hanoverians to power, but it was only possible because of the Stuart marriages into Continental families. What if Sophia had not been chosen, or if her line had not existed? The throne might have passed to a different house entirely, perhaps even to a Catholic claimant, reshaping Britain's religious and political identity. The Stuarts, then, occupy a curious place in history. Within Britain, they are remembered as a dynasty that failed, overthrown by revolution and rebellion. But beyond Britain, they were part of the living fabric of European politics. Their marriages, alliances, and claims tied them to France, the Netherlands, the Holy Roman Empire, Poland, and Italy. They were at times pawns of greater powers, but they were also players in their own right, capable of influencing events and shaping possibilities. Their story reminds us that dynasties are not confined by borders. They operate across kingdoms, weaving connections that can last for centuries. To trace these unexpected geopolitical threads is to see the Stuarts not as a fading echo, but as part of a wider European symphony. Their influence was often indirect, but it was real. They were remembered and used because their blood, their name, and their claims mattered. Even in exile, they remained royal, and that royalty carried weight in a world where lineage could decide wars and marriages could redraw maps. The Stuarts never regained their crowns, but their legacy cannot be measured only in the thrones they lost. It must also be measured in the alliances they forged, the wars they influenced, and the dynastic networks they helped create. Their story is not only Britain's story, it is Europe's as well, a reminder that power and memory often extend far beyond the borders of a single kingdom. The hidden Stuarts, the exiled Stuarts, and the married Stuarts all contributed to this wider narrative. They kept the dynasty alive in unexpected places, ensuring that even as their power in Britain faded, their echoes continued to resonate across Europe. The story of the Stuarts often ends in most accounts with exile, with the loss of thrones and the failure of Jacobite hopes, as if the dynasty simply evaporated into silence after Culloden. But this ignores the quieter legacy they left behind, one that continued through cultural patronage, the shaping of financial networks, and subtle yet powerful ripple effects on wider society. Even when deprived of crowns, the Stuarts and their extended family branches retained identity, wealth, and influence. These tools gave them the ability to affect the development of art, thought, and politics across Britain and Europe. If their political legacy was contested, their cultural and economic legacy remained, and in some ways it is even more enduring. To see this dimension requires us to shift our gaze from thrones and battlefields to salons, churches, theaters, academies, and even merchant houses, where the obscure members of the dynasty made their mark. When thinking about cultural contributions, it is important to recall that the Stuart courts, both in Britain and in exile, were centers of patronage. Monarchs like James I and Charles I were great supporters of the arts, but this patronage did not vanish after the monarchy's decline. Charles I's deep interest in collecting paintings, sculpture, and design laid the foundation for the royal collection that survives to this day. He imported works from great European masters and encouraged the growth of English portraiture through artists like Anthony van Dyck. This cultural climate extended outward into the lives of his children and grandchildren, who, whether ruling or in exile, were steeped in artistic patronage. In exile, the Stuarts continued to encourage the arts as a way of expressing identity and legitimacy. James II, at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, surrounded himself with musicians, writers, and painters who carried the symbols of Stuart monarchy into the cultural realm. His daughter, Louisa Maria, born in exile, became the subject of portraits that circulated among supporters of the Jacobite cause, keeping the dynasty alive in images, if not in politics. Charles Edward Stuart himself became the figure of ballads, poems, and paintings that celebrated not only his failed rising, but also the romantic ideal of lost kingship. This transformation of a defeated claimant into a cultural symbol is one of the clearest examples of how the obscure legacy of the Stuarts influenced society beyond politics. The patronage of science and thought also flowed from these circles. James I had supported the translation of the Bible that became the King James Version, a text that shaped English language and literature for centuries. Charles II, despite his reputation as a pleasure-loving king, was deeply interested in scientific inquiry and granted a royal charter to the Royal Society in 1662. This institution became one of the most important centers for scientific development in Europe, fostering the work of Isaac Newton and many others. Even as political power slipped away from the dynasty in later generations, the intellectual and cultural traditions they had fostered continued to thrive. The quieter branches of the Stuart family, often living in European courts, played roles as cultural conduits. Henrietta, and at the French court, acted not only as a diplomatic intermediary, but also as a patron of the arts, bringing English tastes into French society and carrying French cultural currents back into Stuart circles. The blending of styles, fashions, and ideas was part of the dynasty's broader legacy, creating a cross-pollination of culture between Britain and continental Europe. The exiled Stuarts in Rome patronized Italian artists and musicians, embedding themselves into the cultural fabric of the city. In doing so, they became part of the long tradition of displaced dynasties who preserved identity through art and memory. Beyond cultural patronage, the Stuarts also played roles in the economic and financial worlds of their time. Royalty, even in exile, required funding, and this need drove the family and their supporters to create networks of wealth that reached across borders. Supporters of the Jacobite cause established financial channels to move money into the exiled court. These networks were often tied to merchant families, bankers, and sympathizers who risked political repercussions to provide funds. In this sense, the Jacobite cause stimulated the growth of clandestine financial systems, which had wider effects on the economic landscapes of Britain and Europe. Moreover, the Stuarts themselves held and managed wealth. Their marriages often brought dowries and estates into the family, particularly in France and Italy. These assets were not always grand in scale compared to ruling dynasties, but they were enough to maintain households, patronage, and influence. The presence of Stuart wealth in places like Rome created small centers of economic activity, sustaining local artisans, musicians, and servants. These may appear minor in the great sweep of history, but they demonstrate how dynasties in exile could continue to shape local economies. There is also the broader financial impact of Stuart rule during their time on the throne. Under James I and Charles I, debates over taxation, borrowing, and the rights of Parliament to control finance helped shape the constitutional framework that would later define British government. The conflicts that led to civil war in the mid-17th century were in part financial disputes. The Stuarts' attempts to raise revenue without parliamentary consent fueled resistance that permanently altered the balance of power. Thus, even their financial struggles contributed to the evolution of governance. When Charles II was restored, his court became notorious for extravagance, but it also represented the growing connection between monarchy and commercial wealth. Charles granted monopolies, chartered companies, and oversaw the beginnings of imperial expansion that would create immense economic change. The Royal African Company, for example, was chartered during his reign, embedding the monarchy into the transatlantic trade system that had vast economic and human consequences. While these ventures were not unique to the Stuarts, their participation tied the dynasty to the economic transformations of the 17th century, making them part of the story of early capitalism and empire. Even in exile, the financial imprint of the Stuarts persisted. Supporters who invested money in Jacobite schemes often had to create shadow economies to move funds secretly across Europe. These mechanisms anticipated some of the techniques later used in international banking. Smuggling, coded correspondence, and trusted intermediaries were all part of the system, and they linked distant regions through loyalty to the Stuart cause. Such networks, once established, sometimes remained in place even after Jacobite hopes had faded, influencing the flow of money and trade long after the dynasty itself ceased to pose a real threat to the British throne. The unseen impact of the obscure Stuarts can also be traced through their role in shaping identity and memory. Their supporters created a body of songs, stories, and traditions that survived in Scottish and Irish culture long after the political cause was lost. The Jacobite ballads, with their haunting melodies and coded messages, became part of folk culture, transmitting ideas of loyalty, resistance, and longing for a lost order. These cultural artifacts influenced later nationalist movements, showing how the legacy of a failed dynasty could still inspire political thought centuries later. Another unseen impact lies in the realm of religion. The Stuarts were deeply entangled in the religious conflicts of their time. James I struggled to balance Protestant factions while maintaining some tolerance for Catholics. Charles I's perceived sympathy for Catholicism was one of the sparks of civil war. James II's open Catholicism brought about his deposition. In exile, the Stuarts aligned themselves with Catholic courts and the papacy. This consistent association shaped how Britain defined its national religious identity in opposition to Catholicism. The long shadow of the Stuart religious controversies reinforced the Protestant character of the British monarchy and political order. Thus, even in failure, the Stuarts helped solidify the religious foundations of modern Britain. Their unseen impact is also visible in the way their presence in European courts influenced diplomacy. The exiled Stuarts were useful to powers like France and Spain not simply as claimants, but as symbols. They were reminders that Britain was not secure in its succession, and their existence allowed foreign powers to threaten disruption without taking direct action. This use of the Stuarts as bargaining chips affected negotiations, treaties, and alliances across the 18th century. Their quiet presence in places like Rome or Paris may not have shifted armies, but it shifted perceptions, and in diplomacy, perception often mattered as much as power. The lives of obscure Stuarts, too, show us how dynastic identity could survive without thrones. Figures like Henry Benedict Stuart, the Cardinal, embodied a form of soft power. He could not claim political authority, but his presence in the papal court symbolized continuity. Even Charles Edward Stuart, in his later, diminished years, carried symbolic weight. Supporters could still rally around his image, even when his political chances were gone. The persistence of this symbolic role demonstrates how dynasties can endure in cultural and spiritual dimensions even after political power has slipped away. The ripple effects of their actions extend further into the fabric of European history. The Hanoverian succession in Britain, created partly in response to the Stuart threat, tied Britain more closely to continental politics. The wars fought to secure Hanoverian interests, including conflicts with France, were shaped by the need to defend against both external rivals and internal Jacobite sympathizers. In this way, the Stuarts indirectly influenced the course of European wars well into the 18th century. There is also a personal legacy. The descendants of the Stuarts, through marriages into other noble families, continued to appear in genealogies across Europe. Their blood mixed with that of Habsburgs, Bourbons, and other dynasties, ensuring that the Stuart line, though no longer royal in Britain, still coursed through the veins of European nobility. This blending of bloodlines carried long-term consequences, influencing succession disputes and claims in various courts. The Stuarts, though politically obscure, were biologically persistent. In the realm of thought and literature, their legacy appeared in subtle ways. Writers who sympathized with the Jacobite cause used allegory and satire to express their views, enriching the literary culture of the time. Even those who opposed the Stuarts helped define national identity by positioning themselves against them. Thus, the obscurer members of the dynasty contributed to a dialogue that shaped the intellectual currents of Britain and Europe. To measure the legacy of the obscure Stuarts is to recognize that history is not only about battles and crowns. It is also about culture, economics, and ideas. The Stuarts, even in their decline, left a mark in all these areas. They fostered art and science, they influenced financial systems, and they shaped religious and political identity. Their quieter actions, often overlooked, rippled outward into larger historical narratives. The fading echoes of their political power should not blind us to these lasting contributions. The Stuarts may have lost their thrones, but they did not lose their ability to influence the world around them. Their legacy lives on in paintings and poems, in financial practices and folk songs, in religious divisions and diplomatic strategies. It is a legacy of the obscure, but obscurity does not mean insignificance. On the contrary, the hidden impact of the Stuarts reminds us that history is often shaped as much by those who lose as by those who win, as much by what is remembered in ballads as by what is inscribed in official chronicles. Their story, stretched across centuries and continents, demonstrates how dynasties endure in unexpected ways, leaving behind traces that continue to shape the world long after the crowns have fallen. The long arc of the Stuart dynasty, from its origins in medieval Scotland to its loss of thrones and persistence in exile, offers us more than a tale of royal power gained and lost. It is a story about memory, identity, and the way history itself is shaped. To see the Stuarts only as a dynasty of monarchs whose reign ended in failure is to miss their deeper and subtler legacy. Their cultural contributions, their financial and diplomatic networks, their place in the minds and imaginations of their supporters, and their enduring symbolic power all remind us that dynasties never disappear neatly from history. Instead, they linger in ways both visible and invisible. This realization brings us to why their story matters today, not only as a case study in political rise and fall, but as a lesson in how we approach the past itself. One of the most important aspects of reflecting on the Stuarts is the opportunity it gives us to reevaluate history. For centuries, the accepted narrative in Britain has been shaped by the political realities of succession. The Hanoverians, and later the Windsors, were served by histories that highlighted their legitimacy and stability. This meant often that the Stuarts were cast as failures or villains. James II became the tyrant who had to be deposed, Charles I became the autocrat who lost his head, and Bonnie Prince Charlie became a romantic dreamer who never quite grasped reality. While these portrayals contain elements of truth, they are also deeply shaped by political convenience. To ensure loyalty to the reigning dynasty, it was necessary to paint their predecessors in negative light. When we re-examine the Stuarts without the burden of legitimizing later monarchies, we find a more complex picture. James I emerges as a learned king who struggled with the challenges of ruling two different kingdoms, Charles I as a man caught between conviction and compromise, and James II as someone whose belief in religious tolerance was radical for his time, even if it proved politically disastrous. The exiled Stuarts, meanwhile, can be seen not only as pretenders, but as part of a broader European context, engaged in diplomacy, patronage, and cultural exchange. Their story invites us to challenge simplified accounts, and to consider how much of what we think we know about history is the product of political necessity rather than balanced truth. The reevaluation of history is not only about the great figures. It is also about uncovering the forgotten truths of the hidden Stuarts, those who lived in the shadows of the dynasty. The cousins, siblings, and children who never reigned often reveal as much about the nature of monarchy and dynastic identity as the kings and queens themselves. Figures like Henrietta and at the French court, or Henry Benedict Stuart in the papacy, show how royal influence could persist in different forms, not through crowns but through cultural, spiritual, and diplomatic presence. To bring these lives into focus is to challenge the idea that only rulers matter. This leads us to the second theme, the power of the unseen. The Stuarts demonstrate how even minor figures can leave significant marks. A princess married into another dynasty could alter the course of succession generations later. A cardinal in Rome could carry symbolic authority that influenced Catholic politics across Europe. A child raised in exile could inspire folk songs that fueled nationalist sentiment long after the political cause was gone. The power of the unseen lies in the way small actions ripple outward, shaping culture, memory, and identity in ways that may not be obvious at first. Consider the example of the Winter Queen, Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of James I. Her marriage to Frederick V of the Palatinate seemed like a triumph for Protestant unity, but ended in defeat and exile. On the surface, her life might appear as a tale of failure. Yet her descendants included Sophia of Hanover, whose line eventually inherited the British throne. Without Elizabeth's marriage, the Hanoverian succession would not have been possible, and the British monarchy might look very different today. A figure once dismissed as a tragic exile thus shaped the future of Britain in profound ways. Another example lies in the cultural legacy of Jacobite supporters. The songs and poems created in the 18th century to celebrate the lost Stuart cause became part of Scottish national identity. They were revived in later centuries to inspire new movements, connecting struggles for autonomy and identity to the romantic memory of the Stuarts. These cultural products, born of failure, proved more enduring than the military campaigns they commemorated. Here again, the power of the unseen is revealed. The influence of memory, art, and story can outlast political reality. The unseen also extends into economic and diplomatic networks. The financial structures created to support the exiled Stuarts, often informal and secretive, influenced the development of international banking practices. Their use of intermediaries, coded communication, and cross-border transfers foreshadowed techniques that would become standard in global finance. Diplomatically, their presence at European courts served as a constant reminder of alternative possibilities. Even when they had little chance of restoration, their existence forced Britain to take into account the possibility of foreign intervention in support of their claim. Thus, their unseen presence continued to shape policy. Reflecting on the Stuarts in this way has a broader lesson for how we approach history. Too often, we are told stories that highlight victories, stability, and success. Dynasties that endure are remembered as inevitable, while those that fail are cast aside as irrelevant. Yet the failures and the forgotten can reveal as much about the forces of history as the triumphs. By paying attention to the obscure and the overlooked, we gain a fuller understanding of how the world is shaped, not only by kings and queens, but also by those who stood beside them, those who never reigned, and those who lost. This brings us to the concluding thought. Why the Stuart story matters today is because it challenges us to think differently about history. It reminds us that history is not only written by the victors, but shaped by the needs of power. It shows us that minor figures can have major consequences, that cultural legacies can outlast political ones, and that even dynasties in decline can leave marks that resonate for centuries. To study the Stuarts is to be reminded that the past is never as simple as it seems. In our own time, when questions of identity, legitimacy, and memory remain deeply contested, the Stuart story offers valuable lessons. It shows how the struggle over religion and governance can tear societies apart, but also how these conflicts can lead to new forms of government and culture. It shows how exile and failure do not erase influence but transform it, moving it into new arenas of art, thought, and diplomacy. It shows how dynasties and individuals who seem obscure can shape the course of history in unexpected ways. This should inspire us not only to reevaluate the Stuarts, but also to look for other obscure stories in history. Every dynasty, every nation, every community has figures who were overlooked or silenced, whose contributions were hidden beneath the dominant narrative. By uncovering these stories, we challenge the conventional view and enrich our understanding of the past. The Stuarts remind us that there is always more to discover, always another perspective to consider, and always another layer to history waiting to be revealed. In the end, the legacy of the Stuarts is not only about the crowns they wore or lost, but about the memory they left behind and the questions they force us to ask. Why are some stories remembered while others are forgotten? Who decides which narratives become history and which become legend? What might we learn if we turn our attention to the obscure, the hidden, and the forgotten? These questions extend beyond the Stuarts and into every corner of history. To ask them is to engage deeply with the past and to resist the easy comfort of simple stories. The Stuarts, with their fading echoes and their lingering presence, their visible crowns and their hidden influences, invite us to see history in a new light. Their story matters today because it is not only their story. It is also a mirror held up to the way we remember and the way we forget, the way we honor victory and dismiss defeat, the way we simplify complex lives into neat narratives. By revisiting their legacy, by paying attention to the obscure as much as to the celebrated, we gain not only a fuller understanding of one dynasty, but also a deeper appreciation of history itself. And perhaps most importantly, we are reminded that every story, however obscure, has the potential to shape the world.